just wanted to say, so I have a disability, which means I can't work with the you talking and the chat box. Okay, so I won't see the chat box. That's the easy. I mean, that's not to say that don't use it. I mean, you can use it to chat to each other, but I will be sort of blissfully ignorant of anything that's going on in the chat box. Well, as Molly said, what I think, you know, because we're a reasonable number actually, is what I'd really encourage is for you to put your video on so that we can all see each other, and then also to just put your mic on as if you were in the room, you know, and I think that's how I'd like to run the session. And what as Molly says, you know, really I'm a political psychologist, and what I tend to work on, I use a narrative approach, as you'll see in a minute, quite a dialogical narrative approach to work on public dialogue. But where I tend to work is in quite political situations where public dialogue is not straightforward. It's very vexed, and you can't work towards consensus because consensus is pretty much not possible. So we work in that space, and I run a collab. We call it PDPC. You'll see it come up in a minute. So you have had a session with Molly already, and hopefully you've got it. Have you had a bit of a chat with each other and got a sense of where everyone's coming from? So are most people in the room students doing postgraduate studies? Is that fair comment? Give me a nod if that's the case. Yeah, great, lots of nods. Anyone coming from a different perspective? Is anyone else in the room a practitioner by any chance, who's not a student particularly, but they work in the field? Anyone working in the field as a practitioner, not a student? Okay, so we tend to work with both groups of people, practitioners and academics. It looked like I just scanned across both screens. We're on two screens today, aren't we? So I just scanned across. So it looks like most people are students. So let's just get a measure then. PhD students, show of hands if you're a PhD student. Okay, I think that's nearly, yeah, I'm just going across. A few people haven't got their cameras on, but it's looking like PhD students common. Any master's students? And a hand up there, Fikili, I can see your hand is up there, so great. Any master's students in the space today? Less, okay. So a little bit of a mix. Okay, let me share some thoughts. What I'd like to do is the following then. I'm going to share screen with you now. Let's do that first of all. Okay, I'm not getting the option to share screen because the host is disabled. It's because I'm not a host. I think I'll need to be made a host. Corinne.
Hold on, I can make you a host. That you should. I thought you were. Sorry, Kesi. Just
hey, no problem.
No, anybody should be able to share screen now. Sorry.
Oh, good one. There we go. So let's pop that. Okay, so you should be seeing what looks like a PowerPoint. Is everybody seeing that?
Yeah.
Thanks. That's my head nodding there. I can see him nodding, so that's
Can
great.
You check to turn off the design ideas we're seeing?
Yeah, it's coming. I'll just flip it over. So now it should go to. Okay, so now you're probably seeing my presenter view. So now you should be seeing.
Yes, perfect.
Is that looking good? Yeah, okay. Right. So what I'd like to do then is talk about using narrative psychology for public dialogue. And I want to work towards, I hope we're going to get there actually, the ideal of a border-free world. That's not to presuppose that that's a positive ideal or a negative ideal or a neutral ideal. But I think the idea of ideas and ideals is something that I'd really like us to have a little chat about today. So this is the proposed plan for the next, how are we doing? Yeah, an hour and 20 minutes. That's a good amount of time, actually. So I want to take us directly into the field in the first instance to just show you how we work and how I work and do the kind of work that I do. Then what we'll do is pull back a little bit and I'll tell you then about PDPC. I use a particular continuum that I developed, so I would like to present you that. And then we'll do a small group exercise. Molly and I were just talking about it a little bit before the session started. So 5 groups, 5 small groups, because there's about 30 of you in the room. And we'll look at some data and see if you can. I wanted to introduce the idea of chronotopes with you, and then I will go back to the project again. So I want to introduce the project to you, and then I'll come back once we've had our time playing with some data. Then I'll come back and tell you how we got on with that. So let's just go straight into the field then. If you've got a little scrap of paper, if you still use such things, pens and paper, this will help actually, or you can do it on the screen, or you can just sort of take a few minutes back from the session and answer this question. How would you complete the following statement? This is going to give you about a minute on it, okay? So that you'll just have silence for a minute. It's not like everything's frozen, just for a minute, okay? The world is. What comes to mind when you hear the statement, the world is? I'm not going to ask anyone to say it out loud, so just see where it takes you. The world is. It's worth making a note of it if you've got a, as I say, if you've got a pen to hand. It's worth playing with it a little bit and see where your head goes with it.
Kesi, I should tell you that several people are writing words in the chat.
Oh, nice. Well. Okay, well, we'll have a look at those in a second. Thanks, Molly. The world is. I'll have a look at it now because it's quite calm. Oh, thank you for that. Vanessa, Mahin, Tamara, and Catherine. I can see your comments there. World is. Okay. It's funny, isn't it? Whenever you do anything, when you hold time like that, it suddenly feels long, doesn't it? I mean, 60 seconds is actually quite a long time. Let's keep going then. Yeah, now I say that, then I'm now getting a problem with the. That's what I want. Okay, so now I want you to look at these 2 world maps. You can see one is pretty much, I mean, I know that all projections and map projections are problematic. So, you know, there is an issue around that. But working with these rather familiar versions of how the world might be mapped, have a think about which one appeals to you. So one is the kind of classic Google Earth map. That's the one on the left-hand side. The one on the right-hand side is a geopolitical map, which the lines that you can see there relate to nation-state boundaries. So we call one the border-free world and the other one the bordered world, and the choice is yours, which one appeals to you, and just kind of make a note of that. Okay, so this is what we do with our participants, and I'm going to show you what they did then. The world is. So in this one, for some reason, the recording misses the first sentence, but I just repeat it so we can see what YD says. So you said the world is big. Yeah, and I saw in the chat, you know, a few people said subjective, our home. I'm going to come back to that one, our home, and then complex. I saw that had been there as well. So yeah, the world is big. The world is scary, kind of, the world is fantastic, I guess, and there's a lot of stuff to be seen and stuff to do. Now, this was quite a common way that people responded, which is that if they said something negative, it came out as almost like a first association, they would quite often balance it with something positive. So the world is scary immediately becomes balanced with the world is fantastic, and that's quite a common occurrence in our studies. So I then do exactly as I did with you to a participant of mine who is a Swedish citizen, a male aged 20, which is the world that you see, the one that you would see the world as being like, or how you would like it to be. Now, this, of course, is a pure transcript of my words, and that's how we speak, i.e. not in sentences particularly. So this is YD, this is how he responds. How I'd like it to be, I want it to be, ideally, I'd like a United States of Earth kind of thing. Instead of killing each other, we can actually do productive stuff. Now, he's a soldier, by the way, if you're wondering how he went straight to killing each other. The fact that he's a soldier might have been a part of that story. So we can actually do productive stuff like, I don't know, going to space or something. So I'd like to see this world map. The borderless world one, but most realistically is another question. So you can see what he's doing. He's gravitating towards the borderless world, but then there's a question of being realistic, which is making him shift. Okay, so now to tell you a little bit more, this is YD's map. So he works with the bordered map, and we give our participants, it's an interactive mapping device, and we give them the cursor, and what they get to do is they get to draw, they can use either map, whichever the one they want, and they can draw lines on the map. Okay, so we put them in charge of the world. We give them the opportunity to rule the world, about as much power as you can get in a research project. And then we say, okay, you can rule the world, but here's the deal. If you draw a line on the map, then that means that anyone's crossing that border, that line represents a border, anyone crossing that border would have to show their passport or claim asylum, and somebody else on the other side of the border would make a decision about whether they could come in or not. So it's over to you. Do you want to put borders on the world? Where do you want to put the borders? And this is what YD does. If you could see, I've chosen him because he's not unusual at all in what he does. The key thing is notice how he doesn't, of course, an easy thing to do in this situation, in fact, it's one of the paths of least resistance, is to go for a border-free world. But equally, another path of relatively easy in terms of just doing the task quickly is to stick with nation-state borders. But if you notice what YD does there, and I have to remember, I really remember this interview really well in Stockholm, because he spent so long, really, it's quite a clunky tool that I made, but he spent a long time drawing lines exactly so, as he's done them there. Can you see what he's done? He's done, broadly speaking, as that kind of continental regional level set of boundaries. So what's going on here? I'll just put this up just so that you can see it really. These are all the new publications. This is where it started, you see. I wrote this paper called Public Narratives on Human Mobility, Countering a Technocratic and Humanitarian Refugee Narrative with a One World Solidarity narrative, so One World Narrative OWN. When I used to go around presenting OWN in 2016, 2017, 2018, people always used to say to me, okay, so who are these people who are the one world people? What characterizes them? How many of them are there? Because it wasn't a story that we heard particularly that often. And then I thought, okay, in that study, it was actually about 25% of the participants were taking up this one world position. But it was a qualitative study where you couldn't really make those sorts of claims, and also it was just a part of a study. So I thought, okay, I want to do another study where we're really getting onto this, how many people would idealize the possibility of a border-free world, and what does that mean even? So I then started doing a new project, and this is the collab there, and these are just this paper is now accepted. Is global human identification enough in a precarious world? That one's one, and then this one is the one that I'm doing together with Molly in a special issue that Molly might have mentioned in her session, which is Pandemicality, Global Human Identification, and the Democratic Ideal of a Border-Free World. So, what's going on with the possibility of, what happens when people border worlds or choose a border-free world. So we are Public Dialogue Psychology Co-Laboratory, and really our main aim is to move from public opinion to public dialogue. And this, you can go onto the web, and there's a reasonably public-facing website there, Public Dialogue Psychology CoLab, and it's got some blurb there, and I won't get into it too much, but it just says that there's a world of difference between public opinion and public dialogue. And I think this is, I'll put this up because it gives you a rough idea of how we work. As I said in the introduction, what we're doing really is working on the dialogue between citizens and their governments. And that involves working with citizens in a particular way, which I think this school over the week will be really exploring, working with people in their own storytelling, in the way that we're storied animals, really, in the way that we exist. That's how we make the world make sense to us. And it's also how we change the world, of course, is through these processes of narratives and storytelling. So what we do within our work is to use a concept called the dialogical self, which proposes that this is a little bit different from identity theories that are very popular at the moment. But what it proposes, if you've not come across it before, is that it comes mainly from Bakhtin, although you can draw from other sources, but Mikhail Bakhtin is probably a key person to have a look at if it interests you. And what it proposes is that we have this multi-voiced self, which consists of a whole myriad of what are called I positions. So I citizen, I earthling, you might have thought when you wrote the world is, you might have, somebody said home. So then you have this idea of the homesteader, or I earthling, I think would be one. And then, or you might have go for some of the classic ones like I father, or I mother, or I child, or I Swedish, as I characterized the participant. Maybe I characterized him using some fairly easy categories by age, gender, and so on. But if he was in the room and was describing himself, he may not have used any of those, you see. So you have these kind of positions that you're put in, if you like, and then they're in amongst that are the positions that you take. So that's the idea of the one that we use the most is the I citizen position, in that we bring our participants. We don't really ask our participants to tell their story, although I know that autobiographical approach is really key to narrative approaches. We're quite different in the sense that we invite them to talk about what's going on, various political issues, or the world is, and so on. So they will tell their story. We know they're going to tell their story, but it's just a different in. And what that does is it takes up this I citizen position, and the I citizen position it's what Hannah Arendt called us enlarged mentality, or John Dewey called public capacity. So you have this idea that when you answer, you go beyond yourself, you go to a reference group, and you respond on behalf of this slightly larger group of people. What we need is to, and so on. And you can see that even in that task of drawing lines on the world, you're inviting your participant to take on this kind of governance role. The other side, the reason why I've put those arrows there, is that I used to work in the government before I became an academic, and I want to propose to you that how can I put it, that we are politicians in very much as citizens. We are sort of everyday politicians, but equally politicians are human beings. Now, I can't see your faces because I've got my screen up, but it's just a proposition. But I think it's quite important to propose that politicians and political actors are really quite human. And I think that creates a de-reification of the state. That's not to deny the monolithic nature of power, of course. But what we do is when we're working with the government, is we understand the nature of being a political actor, and that the categories, the key thing is to get on top of the categories that are being used by governments and policies, and to re-territorialize those categories and put them on the table. And that's a great deal in a very simple way of what we do. We take the very concepts that are used in policy and we usually diffract them. I'll show you how in a minute. Okay, I hope it's making sense. These are the studies that I've done so far. So I've been working, out of government, came out of a government in 2008 and started working, first of all, in Edinburgh and Stockholm, nearly always qualitative work, where, as I say, we bring our participants in dialogue with whatever the phenomena are, often using things from the European Union or the United Nations, little paragraphs or pictures or short films, and then we ask them to discuss it. So that was 32 participants, and that time we used these, what I call stimulus-led interviews, and then focus groups. Then I did a bigger study, which was a collab between a whole bunch of us in Dublin, Dusseldorf, Glasgow, Gothenburg, and London, asking some of the same questions. So we have certain questions that we ask every time. So you build that kind of longitudinal feel to the program of work. And then, so that one, it was 2012, 2013, and then with the last study was just before the pandemic. So that was Edinburgh, Manchester, and Stockholm. It stops at 23 participants because the pandemic starts. And because we've got this interactive world mapping tool that's used. I've just introduced you to it a little bit, but it's a big part of the project. We couldn't just switch it over to online, so we didn't do that. Okay, so as I say, we take certain concepts and diffract them. The big one for us really, which I developed really around that first study, actually it came out of that first study, it just came up from the data, because I asked everybody whether they were migrant or non-migrant, exactly the same questions that normally would be asked of migrants. Do you belong? Do you feel like you're a citizen? Are you integrated? What are the measures of your integration? I just asked that of everybody in the study. And what became apparent was, once you ask these questions that are normally asked of migrants to everybody, then you get this whole notion of migration starts to diffract. And what's really key before I talk to you about this lively graph, is the moment, one of the areas that the lens that I use is the migration mobility lens. And that I always treat the public as having degrees of migration. And the really key take home, I'd say, on that is that at the moment, certainly in the European context, what happens is we have this stuff that gets dumped into the public domain, which is the public think this about migrants. 37% of the publics are now pro-migration, 27% are anti-migration. We just get this kind of data constantly dumped into the public domain from polling and attitudinal survey work. And really the difficulty with that is it renders the public static. As soon as the rest of the public hear that, they imagine this kind of generationally non-mobile member of the public taking a view on migrants or the level of migration. Whereas actually when you talk to the public, the public consists of people with different degrees of migration. I mean, it just makes common sense. So if I was to run you through the 10 positions, I mean, let's say straight away, there are obviously more than 10 positions. Okay, so this is just a schematization of it. So position one is someone who's from, I nearly always work in cities, although the rest of my collab tend to work in small towns actually, so I'm in a minority now. So in position one, that's someone who's from the city, Stockholm, Glasgow, Gothenburg, wherever. They're from there, their parents are from there, their grandparents are from there. And that's a sort of generational, you can call it migration free or mobility free if you think the non sort of puts a negative tone on it, or you can make it a positive if you want, but the key thing is that they haven't moved. The second position is someone who's from the city, they haven't moved at all, but they have this is my story, their parents are the migrants, or sometimes it's the grandparents that are the migrants. Now, we don't decide, it's not us who are drawing the line, it's what they're saying in their speech. So if they're saying, because my dad was from Zambia, we're interviewing them in Germany, and they're saying, my dad was from Zambia, my mother was from, so they're evoking the fact that they've got this migrant heritage heritage, and that's what makes for position 2. Position 3 is someone who themselves hasn't moved. When I say migrant, I mean crossing a nation state border at this point, but they've got a partner who is a migrant. The position 4 is an interesting one because that's actually what made me devise this lens in the first place as having 10 positions, is that I noticed that people who'd lived abroad, even if they'd lived abroad for 4 months, 6 months, that was enough actually, then they came back to the place that they were from, they were able to take up this slightly different position, a kind of outsideness, as Barkton would call it, this capacity to stand outside in their thinking when talking about these kind of vexed questions of belonging, citizenship, integration, and so on. So that's position 4. Position 5 and 6 is internal migration. So that's the classic sort of move between sort of Dusseldorf and Berlin, or my story again, you know, moving from England to Scotland. These kinds of internal moves where you're not crossing a state border, but you are, you know, your life is changing in lots of ways. Then single moved settle, that's someone who's moved and now they're settled at the time of interview. Serial settle, moved lots of times and then they settle at the time of interview. Circular migrant, now we're getting into the moving positions. These are people who fully intend to return to the country that they were originally from. And then the serial non-settled, serial migrants. There are other meanings of serial migrants, by the way. This is just how we're using it. So be aware that different scholars use slightly different language. So we use serial migrant to mean someone who's moved lots of times and fully intends to move again. Now, what we find with the position 10 is a really interesting position, is that sometimes that person has been moving since they were a baby. So they, you know, they might have, you know, the mother is German, the dad is Kenyan, and they're in turn born. In fact, that is one of our participants, born in Dublin. So they're sometimes called third country children, by the way. So, you know, their nationality is different to both of their parents. And then they're often moving quite a lot. And when you ask them, you know, are you settled or do you think you'll move again? They'll say, oh, no, we've already decided we're going to live in Norway next, you know, so that belonging is movement to them. And what's in, if you're wondering about this all publishing, you know, if you just type it into Google, it'll come up really easily and in lots of ways, you know, really straightforward accounts and then more dense dialogical accounts. But the key thing is, if you're working out yourself, okay, where am I on Kesi's continuum? Then the key thing is the question, are you settled? Or do you think you'll move? If you know, move for the first time if you're down that one end, or move again if you're down the other end. And I think that's a really key question. And obviously there's that whole caveat that this is at the time of interview, how people respond. You know, people have good intentions to move again. In fact, in our Irish sample, there's a whole presumption of movement. So hence the arrows, you can see the arrows on the chart. All our Dublin participants are in, although they might be in MMC1, that they're on that arrow pointing to the right. You know, they have intention to move because there's such a strong narrative within Ireland of movement. So they might talk about, you know, why they haven't moved yet. That might be the framing, their personal biographical narrative. Once we've done our work, we then do this analysis. So just looking at it now, it feels like it's a rather dense thing. So I'm conscious that I've spoken for nearly 20 minutes. So let's just go through this really quickly then. So basically it's a figure, to keep it simple, it's a figure ground analysis that we do. So we have this figure who I mentioned before, this dialogical self with lots of I positions, I earthling, I parent, I PhD student, you know, all these different I positions that may be complementary, maybe contradictory, but it's a little bit more dynamic in the whole series of identifications. There's a sort of way that they articulate the other and bring this, Buckton called it authoring. So when you look at people's dialogues, you can see the way that they're articulating and authoring the other in their dialogue, but equally there are social we call it social representations, and you may be familiar with it, but this is this kind of common sense ground or the narrative ground by which, you know, all of us have to walk on that ground, really. So we, you know, you can say I mother or I father, but we all know that as soon as you say, you know, I am a mother, I am a father, that reverberates, that has a whole series of connotations, because of those concepts are such live concepts, and that they're, yeah, it's a lot to do with context in which you're saying it and so on. So to get that kind of common sense, if you like, analyzed, we use social representations. And then we look at chronotopes, and that's the one I wanted us to spend a little bit of time on, because it's the one I wanted you to go away with a sort of sensibility about chronotopes, because I think it's really ideal if you're interested in narratives. So the chronotope then is the kind of temporal spatial feature which will involve past, present, future, open and closed. That's the key aspects of chronotopes. So let's go a little bit further into this. Chronotopes then. Chronos, space, topos, time. So space-time, and Barkton was the person who really got on to chronotopes, and what he said is that he read a whole thing of forms of chronotope in the novel, and you'll see it in his book Dialogical Imagination, and he talked about the way that we evoke time, you know, epic time, past experience, quests, and so on. And you can look at all the sort of literary genres. He worked a lot of looking at literary genres. And although he was trained actually with psychologists when he was younger, I mean, his story, his dates are such that he went through, amazingly enough, he went through the Russian Revolution and Stalinism. So just to have lived that length of time is extraordinary. He died in 1970, if I remember rightly, being born in 1890. So he really just saw these major experiences that he went through. So his story, you'll see him in the literature so often analyzing books like Rabelais or Dostoevsky and so on, and you think, oh, why are psychologists and social scientists using Barkton then? But it's because of this, he had to keep doing different things, you know, basically to make a living, and also to stay safe, particularly under Stalinism, that he went to talking much more metaphorically rather than talking about the actual political situation, which is just too dangerous. So the idea, if you're wanting to home in on chronotopes in an analysis, you want to look at how they're doing time, space. Now, one thing that I started looking at recently was Jim Cresswell and Paul Sullivan's paper. If you get into this, they take some, what I'm going to propose that we do is they take some texts and then they do a chronotopic analysis of what's absent in the text and also what's ironic in the text. It's quite a sophisticated paper, but if you like it, it's worth persevering with. Much more straightforwardly, Sue Weiss has written a chapter in her book, and the chapter is called The Chronotope, Fleshing Out Time, and her book is, I would say, is still one of the best books on introducing Barkton, partly because she brings it into sort of a more decolonial feminist sexualities, that kind of reading of Barkton, and I think she just gives it such a refresh in the late 90s that it's actually, even today, I would say over 20 years later, this book has such a fresh feel to it. The key point I take from Sue Weiss's reading of Barkton is that without such temporal spatial expression, even abstract thought would be impossible. Consequently, every entry into the sphere of meaning is accomplished only through the gates of chronotope. And if we go back to JD, do you remember that he said United States of Earth? I thought it was such a sort of fantastic choice of words. It was almost fantastic in that sense, fantasy. So there was this kind of future to it. I mean, obviously that's built into the task. We're asking them to imagine future possibilities. But at the same time, I think the chronotope there is, in a way, you know, and I'll ask you what you think of that. Actually, I won't call it. I don't want to prejudice your own analysis, so let's not call it. So how do we use it? Well, what we do really is we look at chronotopes to find out how. I mean, Barkton always said chronotopes are ideological. And what we do is we look to see how our citizens and also our governments, it's key, you know, we've got both sides of it, you know, so policies, politics, and political actors like politicians are all using chronotopes. So yes, we can. Obama's one is a chronotopic, future-orientated, take back control, build back better. All these kinds of expressions have a chronotopic quality to them that it's worth analysing. Immigrants being presented as recent arrivals to a nation state is also chronotope. So even though those people, whatever group of people you want to imagine in your mind, may have lived in the place for 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, they may still be presented in policies and literature as recent arrivals. Strangely enough, nation states often follow what Barkton talked about as epic time. So they're always sort of organized as if they've been around forever, although nation states aren't actually that old. I mean, if you take the Westphalian Treaty as the starting point of nation states, they're not really that old. It was empires before nation states. So you could propose that migration is older, reasonably, I think, propose that migration is human mobility and migration is older than nation state. Two big chronotopes that are working in our world are the nationalist rhetorical triad, which is used, people like, who uses it? Trump used it, actually. I mean, he's probably the most famous example in recent times. So you talk about a glorious past, threatened or stalled present, and that creates the possibility of a very bleak future. And this has been picked up by a whole bunch of political psychologists, this idea of the rhetorical triad. The triad is always past, present, future. It's just how you want to frame those three states. Threatened present is how populist leaders tend to operate, is that they say, you know, if we carry on like this, we're in big trouble. But if we can recognize where we're at, that we need change, then we have the possibility of a glorious future. Shall we then, let me stop sharing then. No, I'll just, if I can see you, if there's a way I can just escape this and see everybody. I want to keep it there. Yeah, that's the only problem, isn't it? Molly was saying this before. The only thing is if I just want you to take, so let's do something. What I'd like us to do is to go into small groups, but I want us to use two extracts and they're here, you see. So we just need to get a way of grabbing them. If you do a screen grab on, you'll get them. Let me just take this out the way. I'll put that up there.
I can put it in the chat, perhaps. Hold on a sec. No,
I'll just take it. I'll just give you the full screen again, Molly. Okay, right. Right, so there's two texts. There's that one. So that's LH. Have you got a capture of that, Molly?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, thank you. And then the other one is SP.
And now, if you stop sharing, I'll put those both in the chat.
Brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, that should do it. Right. And then what we'll do is I'm just going to stop sharing then. Ah, you're all back. Great.
Okay.
So I'm going to propose that what we do, how are we doing for time? Yeah. So I think we could have 15 minutes on this. But before we go into our small rooms, what I want you to do is to work with those. They're very different from each other, but they're two comments from two people. They're from two different projects. And what I want you to do is to look at how they're using time and how much. So when you think of the future, there's two ways you can think about the future, just putting it in a very simple schematic. You can think of the future as open, or you can think of it as closed. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. What are they doing? Are they keeping things open, or are they closing it down? Are they defining? And where are they going? I mean, with the second study, IELH, there's an element of, sorry, SP, sorry, there's an element of the study asks them to have a future orientation. So they're doing it a little bit because we're asking them to do it. But it would be good to have a chat. But before we all go into our separate small group rooms, anyone got any comments or questions at this stage about what we're doing? Just really any level, straightforward questions about the sort of work that we're doing. Is it making sense? Is it interesting? Some nods. I can see the nods. Any questions, any thoughts that came to mind when I was presenting that?
Can I just say that, I mean, I was really interested to see when people wrote "the world is," to look at people's answers. And of course here, when they're putting it in the chat, one feeds the other, but they're all one or two word things. And it was interesting because I wrote this sentence. I thought, you are such a bore. When I saw what the other people had written, I wrote this really long sentence, you know, with these caveats and this. I was like, yeah, it was really interesting for me to see what other people had written.
I think it's a little bit to do with the chat, isn't it? And also that I think it's almost that we're learning from social media to condense our thinking into words and sentences. But actually what you did, Molly, is what the participants do. They might say big and so on, or they might say, what's it? Somebody said to me, evil. That was their first thing they said. And then they worked with what they'd said. Do you know what I mean? Because it comes sort of straight out of their mouth, evil. And then they had to kind of work. Okay, right, I need to work with what I just said there. And then they elaborated a narrative on why they thought the world was evil. But that was obviously the first thing that thought to them. And you can, when you're analyzing it, you can do that kind of straightforward analysis of whether they've gone in a positive, enchanted direction or a decidedly disenchanted direction. Can I just ask a few sort of straightforward questions then? So in terms of dialogics and a dialogical approach, have you come across it before? Just put a thumbs up if you've come across it before. So Mahin's saying, yeah, I can just about see it. Mahin, why don't you speak? Come on, be brave.
Oh, hi.
Hi. You're saying you made
No, I haven't come across this idea before. Actually, I'm based in LLCL, Language, Literature, Culture, and Linguistics. I'm doing my PhD in Literary and Culture Studies. So my topic is basically about political memoirs by Muslim female migrant politicians. So the basic reason and idea to sign up for this series of masterclass was to look into the scholarships of other fields, that how academics from other fields are looking into this concept of migration and displacement and this, policy and representation. So I come across this, I'm familiar with the intersectionality in terms of critical race theory and feminism. So I could relate to your idea of I with that intersectionality thing, because intersectionality has the same root. It's stuck in different words, but the basic essence of that I idea are similar.
Yeah, I think that's very much the case. And I think that the thing about the I positions is it's very much to do with a version of the self. It's quite micro in that sense. It holds on to the idea of a whole series. The thing I think with intersectionality is because it's rooted in a literature around discrimination and finding the kind of intersections of where the discrimination is occurring, is it sits much more on the ground. I said it's like figure ground. I think intersectionality is more about the ground, whereas the I, that if you imagine this person who's just going through life with all these different I positions, they may be really abstracted I positions. Do you know what I mean? That won't connect to a source of an intersectional category. So that's the only thing I would say. I think there's a great deal of creativity and possibility in I positionality and our capacities that maybe intersectionality won't pick up on, because it tends to work with really key big categories. If you think about it, it's working with race, gender, class, and it's getting them to cut on the grid. I mean, for me, my only slight difficulty with intersectionality is when it goes that way, intersectionality. and actually I lose patience with it because it's so popular now at the moment. And I would always say this, my view on this is this: if you want to work with intersectionality, you need to identify the intersection. What is the specific intersection? And work with that intersection, especially if you're working in the way that we're working, rather than saying, I have a commitment, an epistemic commitment to intersectionality. It's that ality, I think, that's really problematic. But thanks, Mahin, that's a really great contribution, because it makes a connection with obviously one of the big analytical tools of the moment. Anyone else? How is it connecting with other people? So as Mahin has done, she's put her, her thinking on the table and the stuff she's doing. Anyone else make a connection with what we're doing in PDPC and what you're thinking about with your PhDs and your work?
Hi. One of the things that I kind of liked about this dialogical analysis, if you will, is something that we do a lot in decolonial feminist analysis, of focusing on the encounter in the production of the narratives. And I suppose when you were talking about it, although some aspects of it were not familiar in the way that you apply it, the thinking of a dialogical encounter as a humanizing practice or practice of feminist politics in the research encounter was resonated with me, because it's something that I have tried to do, working with queer theory on top of that, while being concerned about decolonizing the research encounter in the dialogue with the participants, as well as in the analysis. Yeah.
Thank you. That is it, Hayley? Am I saying that correctly?
Hayley.
Hayley. So
Yes.
Hayley, that's really what we're doing as well. Although it's hard to present that. I think her book, this one, Sue Weiss, this book here, I know it's going to be backwards on there, but that's the one that, as I was saying, that actually really works, because she does sexualities, and which a lot of dialogical scholars don't. It's all a bit sort of old school patrician framing, but she's the one who really takes it forward, and in the way that you're describing. And that's one of the reasons because I used to work in the government, and what happens when you work in the government is that people become really flat. It flattens. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then
mainstream psychology does the same thing.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It does, doesn't it? It's really reductive psychology, and it's also fast moving. So the advantages, I think you're going to find that across the school, across the week, is that you just get this fleshy, embodied, complex account of human beings, but can be configured, can be analyzed, can be input into that. That I think is the challenge, is to defend this approach, this richer, more thick description, rich description, as you say, humanizing account, against people who think that that's not how to succeed in the academy. I mean, I think that's the real challenge, is to prove, and we've done it. We've done it for 10 years, where you get it in and people are using it. And I always think, since I worked in the government, that actually government actors like stories. They can use them much more than they can big piles of, who wants to stand up in your parliament of choice and try and present loads of statistics? It's a disaster. You're much better off presenting a narrative or a story, because you're going to get the audience. And this is the stuff that we do. And it's one of the reasons why I have a relationship with Karen and Molly, is that we kind of all recognize that this stuff has traction. Great, thank you for that. Any more comments before we take a shot at some analysis? Do you have a sense of chronotopes, what they are? Do some nodding, or if it was just too fast and too much, then shake your head like this. No clue, Kesi.
It might be helpful.
Sorry, Molly.
I was just going to say, it might be helpful for you just to come back a little bit with that.
Yeah. So I think then, I'm going to look at this. So I'm looking away from you, because it's the bigger screen. Okay. So I'm going to give you two little extracts. One is LH. He is a person who moved from Canada to Dusseldorf. And he's talking about home, which I thought would be a nice one to put on the table, because it's so often when you talk about the earth or the world that people start to talk about home. And this is someone doing that. So have a look at it. And here are some questions that you need to ask yourself. Keep it really straightforward. Just ask yourself, is he staying in the present? Is he going to the past? Is he going to the future? That's the first question you want to ask yourself. Then ask yourself, how is he doing that? What's he doing? And just let yourself be creative. Don't worry about kind of technically how to do it. Just think, if you were reading a story almost, what's going on with the way that he does the past? What's going on with the way that he does the future? And that's the thing to do in the group. So that's LH. And then the other one is, SP. This was a really great interview, actually. So SP is a serial migrant. She's in position 10. She'd moved ever since she was a child. And she came from a place, without making her identifiable, she came from a place where the borders in that place also changed. So, it's a bit like being from Palestine. Do you know what I mean? You can come from a place that no longer exists because of powerful forces, geopolitical forces. So she didn't come from Palestine, but she came from a similar sort of scenario. And she was one of these people who did something very unique with the map. I'll show you in a minute after we've had our breakout. But here she is doing, again, just ask yourself the same thing, but the only thing to give you the context on this one is, so the first one is study 2, and then SP is study 3. So she's playing with the map and she's drawing lines on the map. And you can ask yourself, here you are, I'll give you a really straightforward question. Where does she draw? Does she draw lines on the map? And where does she draw them based on the chronotopes in the text that she gives you? So as a group, see if you can work out what she does with the drawing lines on the map. Okay, right, then let's go into the groups then.
Do you want me to try to make them?
Yeah, shall we do that?
I've never done this. Right, so breakout rooms. And I'm going to say, so we have 5 rooms, and
what should happen, I think, is let's do it for 10 minutes, and then you should just find yourself in the new room.
You know what? It's it's a little bit strange, Karin. It has, like, in one room there's one person, in another room there's none. It hasn't equally.
So I'm just going to automatically assign. It doesn't matter. It'll work out in the end. I'm going to open all rooms, and then, like, in 10 minutes we'll close the rooms, and you'll get 60-second reminder that it's about to close. So let's go. See you soon.